People where low self-esteem not only impacts the way they feel about themselves, but how they show up to their relationships. In this video, I'm going to specifically talk about how it can negatively impact your boundaries and give you some tips to move through that. Let's start off with what is self-esteem. A very simple explanation is the evaluation that you have about yourself, the relationship you have with yourself. Typically in our society, we focus on having high self-esteem. So that means that you generally view yourself in a positive way. You can move through kind of any negative thoughts pretty well. You don't get stuck there. And then the inverse, low self-esteem, is that you generally have a negative view about yourself. You get really stuck there. In my perspective, I don't really get stuck on having high or low self-esteem, kind of focusing more on self-acceptance, self-compassion. But for this video, if you do tend to have more of that low self-esteem or getting stuck there, you get really stuck with all the negative thoughts that your mind generates about yourself, maybe a lot of feelings of shame, then that can impact your relationship in terms of boundaries because it might shift the way you set boundaries or not set boundaries. So I want to talk about very quickly then, what are boundaries? Boundaries, again, a simple explanation, is just simply what you say is okay or not okay in a relationship, in any dynamic. It can be a friendship, a family relationship. For this video, I'm focusing a little bit more on romantic relationships, but so it would be what is okay or not okay in a romantic relationship. Why are boundaries important in relationships? Because ultimately it can foster more secure and safe connection in these relationships. Ultimately, if there's a relationship where you know your boundaries are respected and hopefully vice versa, you respect your partner's boundaries, then it allows both of you to be more open and safe and vulnerable. And then there's just mutual level of respect and security. And ultimately, if we're both feeling okay, that is more likely to lead to more of a union of safety and security. It can also help you be much more present in your relationship because you feel like your partner is honoring the boundaries that you set and vice versa. You can feel like you can lean more into showing up as your authentic self because, again, you feel safe in this relationship. We talk about the connection between self-esteem and boundaries. I want to talk a little bit about kind of different types of boundaries. When we think of boundaries, we can have very rigid boundaries or we can have very porous boundaries. So when we think of having rigid boundaries, it's really kind of thing about you put up walls between you and your partner, right? Pretty like steel walls where your partner can't get through. Some characteristics of this is that you really keep this emotional distance between you and your partner. You don't let them into your emotional world or your inner landscape. You don't let them see these more vulnerable parts of yourself. You also might just be more kind of strict or rigid in how you express your boundaries or any flexibility with them. At times, it might mean that you might be dominating your partner or feeling like you need to keep the control at all times at the expense of intimacy or connection with your partner. So how can low self-esteem lead to more of these rigid boundaries? I will say there will be some overlap into the underlying feelings that can influence the type of boundaries, but the way you express it might be different. So for instance, one overlap might be this fear of abandonment or fear of rejection, and that leads you to kind of put up these walls so your partner can't really see you. So even if they do leave you, at least you kind of have the sense, well, they didn't really know me, or in terms of this fear of rejection, they never really see you enough to actually reject you, right? So that could be one way it drives this. If you don't feel good about yourself or shaky about yourself, maybe it also leads to how you can trust others if others feel safe enough to let them in. So that can be one way that you really keep these rigid walls. So how can this negatively impact relationship? It can lead to more isolations, feelings of feeling alone in your relationship, never truly being seen, never truly being connected. It can also lead to feelings of lack of intimacy, definitely misunderstandings between you and your partner. Your partner might also have certain feelings about the fact that you are very rigid or that they can't see you. So that can also negatively impact the way that they feel towards you or how secure they feel in the relationship. Then the other way this can show up, right, is when we think of having those more porous boundaries. So this is really when you don't set boundaries or you have a really hard time setting any types of boundaries. So this can show up as difficulty saying no, more people pleasing, looking for approval, kind of focusing on other people's needs, letting your needs kind of go to the back burner, letting things slide, settling, things like that. I will say traditionally when we think about someone having more low self-esteem, this might be the more commonly associated way that it might show up in terms of boundaries. So how can low self-esteem lead to more lax boundaries? Again, there can be overlap, but this fear of not being liked or disapproval might lead to more over-accommodation. Even this fear of abandonment might lead to more over-accommodation. You'd rather stay with your partner. You don't want them to leave you, so you'll just accommodate, do what they want. Also, if you tend to have more kind of low self-worth, you might tolerate more negative things from your partner, or you might allow other people to treat you a certain way just because you feel like maybe you deserve that or you don't deserve better, something along those lines. So how can this negatively impact relationships? There's a couple different ways with this. One, you might feel really angry or resentful. You might feel unfulfilled. Your partner might really be oblivious. They might not really know that you are feeling this way. They might think you might be okay with everything. So they might be completely caught by surprise that you're feeling unhappy. Again, you might feel just more overwhelmed, burnt out, and maybe you question whether you want to be in this relationship, but you don't really do anything to change it. Before I jump into some tips, give me a thumbs up if you understand the importance of setting boundaries in a relationship. After viewing all these negative effects, give me a thumbs up if you understand why they're so crucial to your relationships. Okay, here's some tips to move through this. Number one is really identify what needs to change, what are your needs, what are your limits, and what are you comfortable with, and then start to have a plan of action of what's going to change. Really start to understand, identify, do you tend to have more porous or rigid boundaries? So then understand what's kind of causing it, how does that show up, as well as then getting a really clear, okay, so then what's going to change in the future? What do you want to change in order to show up as a type of partner that feels better for you, more value driven? So the next thing is really to express to your partner what you're going to do differently. So that can look different ways. So if we think about having more of a rigid boundary, if you tend to be someone that gets more maybe defensive when your partner gives you feedback, maybe something you're going to work on and tell your partner is like, hey, I've noticed that I tend to get really defensive when you point something out to me. What I'm going to do is I'm going to commit to being more open, trying to taking some accountability and listen to what you're telling me, right? So that's something that you're trying to change. If on the inverse, you tend to have more lax boundaries and your focus is to start to implement more boundaries, maybe just start off with a general conversation, what you're noticing, what you're working on, sharing that with your partner. You might also very clearly think about a boundary that you want to set to practice with. So if you think about, hey, let's say your partner always springs last minute get-togethers, whether it's family with friends on you, and then you feel like all spun out because it completely shifts the weekend, especially if you had other things going on. It might be like, hey, I need you to tell me at least 24 hours beforehand if we have something going on so that we can plan it together and I can actually enjoy it and feel more relaxed. In the future, if you can be less than 24 hours, I might say no, I really will consider it. And if it doesn't work out for me, I will say no. And so that's really clear in that you're telling your partner, not that you're setting an ultimatum, but more so what you need to do to be okay, right? So if this kind of feeling really hectic, it's last minute, doesn't work for you, you're communicating to your partner what you need to change or what you're going to do differently. Before I continue with the tips, let me know in the comments below, what's the biggest barrier in implementing boundaries in your relationship? Regardless of what type of boundaries you tend to have right now, what's the biggest barrier that's showing up for you? This next tip is when you're expressing these boundaries or having these conversations, focus on being assertive but not passive or aggressive. So don't swing either way. Again, after understanding what you need to change, you probably have a sense on which side you need to work on, whether you tend to be too aggressive or whether you tend to be more passive. Focus on how you can go more to the assertiveness. Next up is regularly check in with yourself and how you're feeling about your boundaries, right? And really checking in with maybe how the low self-esteem might be impacting that. Check in with yourself and also regularly check in with your partner. So have kind of standing times where you talk about this, or this is part of one of the topics that you guys address. My last tip here is address boundary violations. So don't let them go under the rug. Again, I'm not saying you need to nitpick each and everything, but it's helpful to understand, again, either way, whatever side you're working on, whether you owning when you've messed up, taking accountability, if you're having too much of those rigid boundaries, but also acknowledging when maybe your partner violated a boundary. Did they know? Did you guys talk about it? Did you address it? Did you figure out what you can do differently next time? Also, as a note, you also want to notice when things are going well. So whether in this conversation, when you're doing regular check-ins, or even when you're kind of talking about a violation, it might be helpful to point out examples when things went really well to buffer that conversation for both of you, or just for you guys to have a general sense of what's working in the relationship. All right, guys, I hope this video is helpful for you. This third video in this playlist about navigating low self-esteem in relationships. Check out this next video in this playlist to continue working on this. And like I always say, I encourage you to continue nurturing your mind, body, and soul, whatever that looks like for you guys. Thanks.